Welcome to Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study at St. Paul Lutheran Church in this winter-spring season of 2021 as we are taking a look at the Bible's big stories in their telling and in their retellings. In this session, we will take a look at the telling of another big story, the story of Israel enslaved in Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt, together with the beginning of its time in the wilderness and its visit to Mount Sinai, where Israel hears what it means to be the people of God. In some ways, it starts a story over again. We've seen the ancestral story in Genesis 12 through 50, which moves Israel into Egypt, where Joseph had been taken by God in preparation to save the whole family during a famine. In the beginning of Exodus, the Bible clearly recognizes that there's been a passage of time. So a little bit of recounting who it was that went down to Egypt, but then a 430-year gap. And a Pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph. Well, of course, after 430 years. So in some ways, this story of who is Israel sort of gets started over again in Egypt. And there are, as you've noticed in reading chapters 1 to 24 and then 32 to 34, there are a few references to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph. When we think of the matriarchs as well, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah. But this is not a continuation of the family narrative that we had in Genesis. This is now the story of a people related to another people, the Egyptian people, and especially to their Pharaoh. And Moses becomes a central figure in this, born not of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob explicitly, although we're given to believe that everybody who's now in Egypt as a Hebrew is descended from that family. But Moses understood more as a child of Egypt, both the Hebrews in Egypt and also in one part of the story, raised within the court of Pharaoh. But even Moses is not only defined by that, because after all, he ends up out in Midian, where he finds Jethro, a Midianite, whose daughter Zipporah becomes Moses's wife. So Egypt and Hebrews and Midianites, this is a very different narrative landscape than we were seeing in Genesis. We can also note, of course, that this text, this story, like the story we saw in Genesis, seems to be made up of a number of different sources, because we hear a number of different things told several times. So, for example, what is the deal with God's name in chapter 3 of Exodus, but then God's name again in chapter 6 of Exodus? Did the ancestors know the name of God, the personal name of God, YHWH, what is shown in the New Revised Standard Version and its tradition as caps and small caps, the Lord? Did they or didn't they know that name? Is Moses commissioned to go to Pharaoh and commanded to return to Egypt once or twice? What about Aaron being named as the prophet in this case, the mouthpiece for Moses? And is Moses set up as God to Aaron, or is Moses set up as God to Pharaoh? And Aaron will be the prophet to Pharaoh. Um, what about the institution of the Festival of Unleavened Bread in chapter 12 and then again in chapter 13? And oh my goodness, the story of crossing the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. Um, do the waters pile up on one side or are they divided so Israel walks through the middle? That chapter is a classic example for students in seminary to learn how to see the different sources that are present in the telling of these stories. Now, we don't need to dwell on the particulars of those sources or how this comes to be a composite text, because for us, the Bible as it comes to us as a continuous narrative is what has been handed down through our generations, our ancestors, and given to us to make sense of. But it's worth noting because as readers of this story, we're going to notice those kinds of duplications or internal tensions within the text. Suffice it to say, I would suggest that there are different traditions that have been brought together in order to tell this story. Well, as it's told, it's also composite in another way, and that is that there are so many different elements here, which biblical Israel and then later the church could draw on in order to learn something about God, about the people of God, about creation and the world. So we have, for example, the whole story of how Moses comes to be recognized as a leading figure for Israel, both in terms of his role countering Pharaoh and leading the people out, and also in terms of his role at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb in receiving the Torah, the lifestyle of God's people from God at that mountain. We also see that there is an inauguration of ritual that takes place here, particularly if we look at chapter 12, chapter 13, and the way in which this festival, this observance, this commemoration that we know as Passover comes about, both in relationship to the Passover lamb that is slaughtered and eaten, and also in relation to the unleavened bread that is baked and eaten. We have a number of stories which tell us about the place names of things or the names of individuals, once again, similar to what we saw in Genesis. Those could be picked up. We have a great song in chapter 15 characterizing God as the deliverer of God's people that can be recognized as a powerful liturgical element. We have the tradition of Israel murmuring in the wilderness in chapters 16 and 17, contrary to God, doubting God, wondering whether it might be better to go back to Egypt, and complaining about the way in which the road through the wilderness to which God has called Israel demands their trust and their confidence, even up to the last moment before God does in fact provide. We come to Mount Sinai, and we see the first of the lifestyle codes that the Torah includes, what's known as the covenant code, language that comes to us from chapter 24, verse 7, Moses wrote all the words of this book of the covenant for the people. So we have lifestyle code to draw on. And then in chapters 32 to 34, the story of the golden calf, the shadow of idolatry dropping across the story of the people, as well as Moses and God seeming to debate about whether God will or will not continue with this people, and just exactly whose people are they? Are they God's people? Are they Moses's people? And finally, the second giving of the 2 tablets of the code, the second giving of God's will for the people to live as God's people. And this at last in chapter 34, verse 28, is where we see that Moses wrote the 10 commandments, even though what we know as the 10 commandments are already recorded back in chapter 20. And what precedes that phrase, the 10 commandments in chapter 34, is a whole different set of commandments. All of these different elements that make up this big story of Israel moving from slavery through Exodus to being God's people are elements that can be picked up by other biblical writers within Israel and by biblical writers among the early believers in Jesus in the New Testament. What do you make out of this big story? What elements of this do you see? I'd suggest there are a number of broad themes that one might find here. One is just whose people is Israel going to be? What kind of a people? Are they going to be Pharaoh's people? Are they going to be the people of Moses? Are they going to be God's people? Are they going to be the people of other gods outside Egypt, but now in the wilderness, the ones whom the golden calf represents? Are they going to be the people of the God of the ancestors? That's one possible large question that comes out of this story. Another one is, how shall Israel live? After all, a lifestyle code is all about how Israel lives. And this code, just in the 4 chapters of chapter 20, 23 that we read here, let alone the ones that follow in 25 through 31. Just here we have tort law about damages and about criminal law when people are harmed. We have civil law about how loans are negotiated. We have religious law about idolatry and about the ways in which festivals are celebrated. We have legal process addressed. How many witnesses are necessary, and how do you actually go about hearing a legal case and making a decision? All of this is part of the richness of this big story. And as we've come to explore these stories together, the questions again for us are, what is it that resonates for us? Where might we find something of particular relevance to our lives? How do we hear this big story? And then in our next session, we'll take a look at how some other biblical writers have heard this big story and what in it they have found to be stimulating, instructive, comforting, challenging, something that they hear as a word of God from this big story in the Bible. I look forward to talking about this big story and what it means for us, how we hear it, and then moving on to those other retellings of the big story of slavery and Exodus. God bless.